Hi, friends. On today's episode, I welcome Veda to the podcast to share her incredible sovereign birth stories. Her first birth was midwife assisted, but her midwife stayed out of the room during the birth. And then she went on to free birth, her second baby. And she shares with us her journey to discovering freedom from the system, choosing not to get a birth certificate for her son, and why she chose to have a lotus birth. Veda's stories and insight are a gift, and I really hope you all enjoy as much as I did.
Yeah. So my name's Veda. Let's see, background. That's so loaded. But I guess I will just explain that my background is very medical minded. I was very in the box, I guess, on a million different things. And my awakening actually started with a health crisis. And I mean, I was just passed around from doctor to doctor to doctor trying to figure out what was going on with me. I was really outsourcing my authority in probably any way, every single way you could imagine, truly. And when no doctors could figure it out, I was put on a million different hormones, million different pills, all the things. Eventually, there was like something inside me that said, maybe your body knows what to do. Maybe because I spent all my time hating my body, thinking my body was attacking it, like it was my enemy. And I just had a lens change after, well, really, it was after a doctor that was telling me I was crazy and maybe I needed to see a psychiatrist instead, all these things.
Wow.
Anyway, I really have to thank that doctor truly because and I have to thank my husband too because I would just cry after these appointments and my husband was like, "Well, the thing is this is a physical, so we can actually see that there's some crazy stuff going on." Cuz at the time in my life, I was like actually growing a beard and I was also lactating at the same time. And as much as I'd like be Googling my own symptoms and stuff, I kept saying, I think it's PCOS, I think it's PCOS. And every time we do testing, it was not. But also the lactating was weird. Anyway, my husband was like, no, this is physical. But that got me thinking that maybe it's in my mind and maybe it's more than just the physical aspect,
Mhm.
right? If all these pills aren't doing something. So I actually started doing emotional release therapy. And as I started like awakening I recognizing actually this imbalance was a lot to do with my imbalance in my masculine and my feminine being on birth
Wow.
control for like 15 years. Like there's a lot of like compilation honestly that like led to this awakening. But honestly for me it just like blew open this like medical world for me that I was like, "Oh my gosh,
Yeah.
everything's a lie." I really started researching and what was crazy for me actually is I when I was 5 years old, I almost died from like internal bleeding. And the doctors couldn't figure out what it was. It was, the name of it was called idiopathic thrombocytopenia purpura. And literally what happened is my parents eventually brought me into the ER because I was just bleeding. I wouldn't ever stop bleeding. And they were like, okay, if she didn't come into the hospital tonight, she would have died because of the pressure on of her head on the pillow. Like it was urgent. But
Whoa.
they label it idiopathic. Like we have no idea that's what the word means. We have no idea why it happens, but it can happen throughout your life. So they just told me, be careful when you're menstruating, be careful like when you have childbirth, this bleeding thing could happen. You could just bleed to death, whatever. And at this point in my life, when I was like, okay, I'm researching everything, I started researching the vaccine inserts, all these sort of things. Come to
Mhm.
find out that it was actually a side effect of my 5 year old's things. I'm trying to, I guess I should have just
No, say
watch my
whatever.
language, I don't know
Like,
where I have to censor myself, but, yeah, anyway, there it is, idiopathic thrombocytopenia purpura. So all these, like,
wow.
connections started being made in my mind about, like, my life path, why I was experiencing all these things. I was also, a dental hygienist, which I had to get lots of different pokes, for that I feel like there was all this
Yeah.
combination of, like, why I was, but I eventually saw a doctor that was like, "You have a brain tumor, I'm pretty sure, so let's do an MRI." So we do an MRI and literally nothing shows up. But he's like, "That's weird because it couldn't be anything else, so let's just treat it like it is a brain tumor." and you're going to be on brain tumor medication for the rest of your life. You can't have kids, all these things. Like, we were clear, it was clear I wasn't ovulating too. So anyway, silly me, because I was begging for a savior at that point in my life. I listened. I took this freaking tumor medication for a year, even though there was no nothing that showed up on this MRI. And after a year, that's when I was like, hey, I have no one else. I don't trust doctors. So maybe I'm just gonna stop everything. Stop it all and just see what happens. Really focus on my spiritual part. So anyway, that was a really long version of explaining like what really began to like open my mind to big pharma, the medical industry. And so when I like surprise got pregnant, even though I was told I wouldn't because I wasn't ovulating, which actually is the craziest part, is that I know I was not ovulating. So I feel like there is something so much more beyond the physical, that when a baby's supposed to come, they freaking come,
Yeah.
especially since my prayers and affirmations were that I was ready to embody my like divine feminine. So, I mean, what more feminine is becoming a mother? So it in
Yeah.
hindsight, that was clearly an answer to my prayers. But
Yeah.
anyway, so this is when I was like, oh my gosh, okay, I'm researching everything. But I knew nothing about birth. I knew no friends that even had home births. So I just like, all I knew was like midwives were more holistic. So I actually scheduled my first appointment with a midwife in the hospital. And I went for 2 appointments, and I just like, it was so clear to me that there was nothing different than seeing an OB. Like, and
Yeah.
I didn't have insurance at that time. And so when I kept saying like, hey, is this necessary? Like all these tests, they literally like, it felt like there was a glitch, like when I would speak to them and they didn't know how to respond, where, because everything they were doing was like, this is what insurance covers, so this is what we do almost. Where I'm like, but I don't have insurance. And they're like, well, we still do this test because I don't know, they just really couldn't answer. So I ended up telling my husband, I'm like, I feel like if we keep going down this path, I'm really gonna like disappoint myself. I'm like getting really strong feelings. We need to look somewhere outside the system. So I ended
And
up
not
finding
to mention paying a fortune for all of these
rehabilitation.
unnecessary tests.
Yes, exactly. And with like my blood and medical background or whatever, like they were literally doing blood tests every week to check my platelet levels and all this stuff. And I just felt like it was just like, it felt so excessive.
Hmm.
So anyway, I find a midwife who was amazing. Um, but that began my like my real research on birth. So that's when I super started researching all the tests, all the things, all the, whatever. And so I declined the GBS test. I didn't want to do an ultrasound, but I was talked into it my 20 week, and I look back and I really regretted that. Um, but overall, I was like, no Doppler, no all these things, because I was researching. And once I got to like 36 weeks, I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize there were different kinds of midwives. I started recognizing, okay, my midwife is licensed, all these things. I didn't realize until the very end what that meant. And so I talked to her and I was like, you know what? I understand. I'm actually really desiring a free birth. But I've actually never been around birth. I don't have any friends or family or anyone actually that's been around birth. So I want to try and find a way that's I can really like have this desire that I want, but also have people that I feel like I can rely on. So
Hmm.
she was like, luckily for me, she was like, I will be outside the door if that's what you need. So she did, everything was beautiful, everything was great, because I had like manifested this specific birth in my mind and how I imagined it, this free birth, but she was there. So after that, I feel like it was like 95% of everything I could have imagined, right? Because one, it wasn't at my house. It was at a birth center that was like 5 minutes from my house. So having to pack up and leave, I was like, I will never do that again. And two, like we literally did do this ourselves. Me and my husband. He caught baby, I did it, and why I paid a lot of money for someone to witness, which I appreciate her. She was a big stepping stone for me. Looking back, I didn't need it though. If I had someone else in my life that maybe had free birth or something that said you could do it, I feel like that story would have been so different. But that really set the grounds for me in my next birth. But I will quickly say, with the licensure with this midwife, she was pressuring me within 10 days to do the birth certificate. And at this point, I had like spent my entire pregnancy learning about birth, because there is a million things to learn, like debunking birth. You know what I mean? Like all the
Mhm.
things we don't need, all, the business of birth that I didn't really think much on after. I had learned a few things about the birth certificate, but I didn't know what else to do. So like with literal knots in my stomach and having this like time frame of 10 days, I got a birth certificate for my first child. So after raising him for a little bit, there was always this like stirring inside me that was like, hey, now that I know about birth, I know without a doubt my next birth is going to be a free birth. It's going to like be everything that I wanted for my first birth. But also, I'm going to spend this time now researching what to do instead of the birth certificate so that I can really like say 110% I did my part. You know what I mean? I came in
Yeah.
prepared. So that's what I did. And also, on top of the fact, my husband had like booked this trip for us to go to Mexico 3 months after my like guest date. So I was like, hey, really, I need to figure out how to get a passport too, ASAP, without the birth certificate. So that's what I did. When it came time to, like I said, my first baby was like 95%, but this one, I was like, I'm consciously calling this baby in, because I also was doing a lot of research on how every emotion, the way the baby's conceived, the way they're gestated, the way they're birthed, all of that actually creates this core emotion or core personality in a baby. And I had spent my life up until I was 30 trying to release old trauma. And I was like, I am bringing babies in to this earth because I have a deep belief that the babies coming in, their purpose is to shift the world, shift the consciousness of the world. And we as parents actually need to be able to hold a vibration that's going to hold their frequency. So I felt really compelled that this baby needed to be consciously conceived, consciously gestated, and consciously birthed. So that's exactly what I did. I like literally in this moment, well, I know exactly when my baby was conceived because both my husband and I like connected to this soul, called him in, and I knew. I just knew. Um, and despite, I know there's like, and I'm not against like cycle tracking and all those different things, but one thing, like I said, my first baby had taught me that it's like, it's beyond the physical. Yes, there is a physical aspect, but it's like, it was so beyond that I was like, I know that when my baby soul is ready, will know. So anyway,
Yeah.
we were consciously conceived. And never took a pregnancy test because I felt like I was like, the real test in all of this is to fully trust my body, fully trust myself. And even a pregnancy test felt like it would betray my body and betray my baby because it's something outside of me. So I
Yeah.
chose, I'm like, I'm going to fully lean into full trust. I'm going to connect to this baby, which I mean, my first baby had led me to his perfect birth. But this one, I was like, okay, now I know can lead me to all the things. So um he did. He just led me to like a full wild pregnancy that was like, there is nothing outside of you, no ultrasound, nothing that you need other than this connection. And I feel like every emotion that comes up, even the physical things, are all divinely meant to allow us to heal rapidly. Like if you want to heal, like pregnancy is like the fast track to healing because it will show up.
Absolutely.
you know and so it was all these things that were showing up, and even the conversations with my husband, because with this one, when I was like, hey, we're having a free birth, like no question about it, a lot of fears were coming up for him too. So I loved that it allowed us to have these conversations of what's coming up inside, because for him, he was like, I love that a mother goes into like la la land when they're in labor, but he felt like he needed to be the midwife. And I had to like tell him over and beautiful conversations, I feel like, that were really groundbreaking when we'd really just like sit in the fear of it. that his job was not to be the midwife. His job was to literally be the shaman, to be the witness. And that was so like it, I could just see the relief on him taking that weight off, that his job was never to be the midwife or any of that. I mean, we did come prepared, like fully prepared with what any form of, like, I'm saying this in quotations, emergencies that could happen, and how to, first of all, prevent anything and how to handle things, but really recognizing that there were only two things that I would have considered emergencies. And I had a deep belief because my husband and I had been doing all the inner work. And I have really, gosh, this is something I could talk about forever, is I personally feel, I mean, the way trauma works is that a trauma happens and it's always trying to recreate itself for resolve. So I went down the whole rabbit hole of like my ancestry and my birth, like my own birth story, how I was born and the traumas that were created in my own birth, and creating a new imprint so that I wasn't recreating the traumas in my own birth, if that makes sense. So that is something
Absolutely.
I actually like help women do, is start creating a new imprint, really addressing the way we were born and tapping into our own birth story. So I feel so deeply that when those things show up in birth, any form of trauma, because it's coming up to be healed. So if
I
we
love
heal
that you bring
it,
that up.
yes,
It's so important. So many people don't know their birth stories, and
yes,
it's like essential for healing birth trauma.
yeah, yes. People don't, yeah, it's so, it resonated so deeply in my bones once I started learning about that. And yeah, that's really why I feel like all these emergencies we hear were opportunities for healing. And a lot of times those signs were coming early on in that person's pregnancy, that they shoved down those feelings or shoved down those physical ailments that our bodies were telling us. And then it showed up in our birth. So I truly believe that if we address all those things, heal all those things, sit with all of those things, um they don't show up in our birth. Trauma doesn't show up in our birth because it's been resolved. So
Yeah.
that was something both my husband and I did. I think we put a lot of pressure on women, um but it is, your husband has his own, or your partner, whoever you're having a baby with, is going to have their own stuff. Were they consciously conceived? What emotions were there, was their mom going through during their pregnancy? How were they birthed? All of those things need to come to consciousness. So anyway, yeah, those were a lot of things that we did during my pregnancy. So when it came to our free birth, it was literally like, one thing, if I could say, that was the most, I feel like set the stage for me in both of my births, was the fact that my husband and I, we both wrote down a vision of how we imagined this birth. And we meditated on this vision almost every single day. And I can tell you both births happened exactly as we had envisioned, because we had experienced it 1,000 times before it actually happened. So that was like so magical for us. And we actually asked our baby to guide us to a song that was like their song. So every single day when I was getting ready, I was envisioning playing this song, envisioning their birth. And it was just, I truly feel like we're creators of our lives. And when we connect to our baby and allow them to speak on like what kind of birth they want, they will guide us. They will guide us completely. So my baby, both of them guided me to exactly their perfect, beautiful birth. And it happened just that way. So it was amazing to have this amazing birth at home. Just my husband and I did have my mom there because she fully trusted me, um, to help with my 2-year-old. Because it felt really important for me to have him witness or be a part of it as much as he wanted to. Again, I'm like an avid researcher on like more like this, I don't know even know how to say, but more spiritual things, where recognizing that having a sibling witness their own sibling, what a spiritual connection that was.
Hmm.
So that was important to me, that he got to be there. And yeah, we, for
I
me,
wanted
yeah,
to ask one question about you inviting your mom, because I love that. so much. It's not something that you hear often with free birth stories because so many people come with their fears, and that can totally disturb a beautiful free birth. So was your mom was there ever a point where she was like, "Oh my goodness, like, are you sure?" And then was it kind of like an unraveling from there, or was she like all for it from the beginning? Like, how were you able to gauge like if she was ready for that experience, like if it was a safe thing
Yeah.
to invite her into that space?
I love that question so much because exactly like you said, every single person is an intervention in your birth, right? With their feelings. So for the birth of my first child, she was not invited because as I was digging deep into like the ancestral, the birth trauma, all that stuff, recognizing actually how much fear my mom held around birth, I was like, you're not invited to my space. So she was not invited to my first birth. After having my first birth, and I think she really like I'm grateful for the role that I feel like I play in her life because she was able to really like open her eyes to so much with my example of my baby's first birth and just how I live my life and really live outside of the system in all ways. That really my first baby 1,000% was this like quantum leap for me in how I live my life, raise my baby. So I had that full like 2 years of my first child to really for her to she shifted in everything. Like she deeply I could see the change in her deeply trust me in everything that I was doing. There was this deep trust. So
Mm,
honestly, she was the only person I could ever even think of that actually really trusted me and my decisions. So that was really, really cool. And I feel like healing in so many different ways for our relationship to have that 2 years of deep belief in everything that I was doing. So yeah,
yeah,
that
that's
was
beautiful.
really cool.
That's beautiful.
So, but yeah, there was no one else, Eric, because I really was so selective on who was allowed in my space, even the first time. So the second time was really cool to have my mom be able to be a witness there. Um, because like I said, I really, I mean, really, I loved that she trusted me, but I wouldn't also probably wouldn't have had anyone there if I didn't have a 2-year-old. So
Yeah.
that was that really important aspect to me. So, but yeah, another thing that like was so deeply an imprint for me that I did that my first baby led me to was Lotus birth. Lotus birth literally oh, the spiritual aspect of it was life-changing. Literally would never do it any other way. Physically feeling that change of like I was saying, I have this deep belief that babies choose how they're born, they choose when they're born. I have a deep belief that they should be able to choose when they transition from the umbilical cord. That
Hmm.
that is a choice that we should leave up to them. So I did that with both my babies and feeling, of course, there's the physical benefits of, I think a lot of people in this community know the physical benefits of like delayed cord clamping, waiting till it's like completely white and flat. But yes, those are the physical benefits. It's so beautiful. But when you wait beyond that, everything is spiritual, everything is felt, and it is so symbolic that I feel like anyone that's had like physiological birth, you recognize that you yourself as a mother, you go into the ethers and you retrieve your baby and then you bring them back to earth. And with Lotus birth, I'm not kidding you. It was there were days and how do I even explain? Like I feel like the placenta is literally the spiritual twin of the baby. It is the spirit because it is actually the biological like DNA twin of your baby. And I feel like the purpose of that sacred organ is to bring your baby earthside. And that it is your baby's choice on when they fully transition earthside. And it also so that connection from baby to placenta is actually a meridian or energy circuit to their own tuition. And it's so symbolic with the reason why we call it like a gut feeling because that energy circuit literally comes from our gut to this
Yeah.
placenta, right? This energetic connection. But it's not only baby and their own tuition, it's mother and their connection to baby. So I truly feel like my babies, their placentas detached 3 and 4 days after birth. And I'm not kidding, the moment they chose to detach, I literally felt my feet like land on the earth. Like suddenly I was on the earth too. Both of us like transitioned to
Mm.
our side in that moment. And I felt my aura like physically expand, that I was like capable of so much more. It was so you can't describe the feeling until you do it. And for me, I'm like, I would do it and never do it any other way. And also this, like I said, these imprints that we're leaving on our children, recognizing that they get to choose when they're ready to fully do this, when they're ready to fully transition, and what kind of imprint that leaves for the rest of their life. Feeling like
Yeah.
they are sovereign decision makers, that they do create their own lives. And as
Yeah.
parents, our job is to allow the baby to make decisions on their own accord, and everything does happen in perfect timing. And our job is to just support that.
Yeah,
So,
and it's like really a continuation of the undisturbed process, right? Like you chose free birth so that your baby could have the most gentle transition to, earth. And it totally resonates and makes sense in my mind to do that with the placenta as well, right? Because when we're cutting the cord, like that, we're intervening, we're intervening somehow and leaving, potential room for things to go wrong and get complicated and sticky, like what are you cutting the cord with? Could that lead to an infection? Like, there's so many, it's just like any other intervention in birth. So it makes complete sense. I
yeah.
want to take a minute to just go back to your free birth story because I know that when choosing free birth and, just choosing to take full authority of your body, your baby, like that comes with so much responsibility and can also come with a lot of fears because what we're taught is normal is like one little fraction of what actually is on the spectrum of normal. And so to I love to just hear stories that have like little unique, pieces of like in the system this would have looked like, something that needed medical intervention for or some kind of emergency, like did you have any of that in your birth where, if you were in this system, it would have gone down, the intervention spiral, but because
Yes.
you were home and you were the authority in your birth space, like you got to just experience what normal physiological birth is.
Yes. You know what? I love that you mentioned this, because when I would, because I at this point with I am just kind of one of those people where I'm like, I'm making this decision and I own it and I'm happy to talk about it. Other people's fears aren't going to affect me. So what's interesting, when I would talk about the fact that I was going to have a free birth, there were three things that I noticed most people had a fear around. One was, well, my baby had the cord wrapped around their neck, and if I wasn't in the hospital, it would have been an emergency. So there was that. Second thing that I hear people talk about is hemorrhaging. They hemorrhaged, that they weren't in the hospital, they would have died, whatever. The third thing was baby's first breath. They were worried about, well, what if baby's having a
Mhm.
hard time breathing? Do you know resuscitation? All these things. So interesting thing is, all three of those things actually happened in my birth. None of them were scary, like not even for a moment. And I 1,000% feel like if there was someone outside of me in the room that I felt like knew more about birth than I did, I'd be looking for them to be like, well, what do you think I should do? But because there was no one else in that room and I knew no one cared more about that baby than I did, it allowed fully for my intuition and motherly instincts to jump forward without even a second thought. So the second baby was born and he had a cord wrapped around his neck, I just gently undid it and everything was perfect. But just think, if I was in a hospital, that would have been immediately cut because that would have been
Yeah.
scary. That's just policy. Um, Second, he did take a moment to breathe, and I was patient. And honestly, my motherly instincts were to rub his back and talk to him. And he started taking his first breath. And I could tell that there was some gunk. So I did intuitively just put my mouth over his and suck out some of the gunk, and everything was perfect and beautiful. Like never I I can't imagine anything worse for me than how that would have been if his cord was cut and he was pulled away, and what trauma imprint that would have been, because that was actually trauma imprint of mine when in my own birth, of being cut and taken away from my own mother. Um
Hmm.
how I couldn't imagine. I couldn't imagine having my baby taken away from me. So that was like amazing and beautiful that my intuition was able to keep that connection where anywhere else it would have been an emergency. Also,
Yeah.
I bled a lot.
I was just gonna ask you about that because we hear this hemorrhage story all the time. It's totally used as a way to fear monger. And you have this, thing kind of hovering over you because of this diagnosis you got when you were a child, which
Mhm.
was really like a side effect of a vaccine. But, you know, it can be so hard sometimes to like take those stories out of our minds, especially in situations like this where you are taking full responsibility for everything and the outcome of this. I find that, yeah, I mean, I don't know if we ever release our fears fully. I think we have to kind of go through the veil and just, keep going regardless of the fears. So, was that a fear of yours at all? Or, how was your response when you saw all the bleeding?
It wasn't a fear actually, because the same thing had happened in my first birth, which is actually interesting that all three of those same things happened in my first birth. Where I had first of all told the midwife, I was like, "You are not giving me Pitocin." The only person that gets to decide whether I'm acting different than myself is going to be my husband. And it's all going to be based on how I act,
Yeah.
not anything else, unless I say otherwise. You know what I mean? So going into this birth, which thank goodness with my first birth, absolutely my midwife was like, "That's a lot of blood. That's a lot of blood." And I was like, "Nope, nope." I had brought my own tincture of Angelica and shepherd's purse because I'm like, I'm preparing myself. So I actually had that prepared for my this free birth. And I knew exactly when I was like so calm that I could just recognize, hey, that is a lot of blood. First, I'm going to move positions just to encourage the placenta to come out. So I did. It came right out. I could feel, and I was so coherent. Everything was there that I could calmly be like, hey, I asked my husband, hey, give me some shepherd's purse. And literally that was it. So it was like,
No
that's
drama.
no drama. No need, but without question, if I hadn't really like first in the first scenario with my first birth, told my midwife that without question, I'm not doing Pitocin, I'm doing this myself, she would have given me Pitocin. But I think she knew
Oh, of
how
course.
intentional
Yeah.
I was. And yeah, without question, a midwife would have wanted to intervene in the second birth because I actually bled way more in my second birth
How
than I
did
did
you
my first.
how did you feel physically, and what was your reason for asking for the shepherd's purse? Like, what did it for you? Were you feeling anything, or what were you just like, I want to take this as a precautionary thing because it
Yeah.
seems like a lot of blood?
Yeah, really it
Mm.
was more that, where I was just like, it can't hurt, and I feel like I'm witnessing that I recognize there was just something inside me that was like, now's a good time. I wasn't
Yeah.
intending on doing it at all, but it was like I'm prepared with it, and I see that it just intuitively felt right, I guess. That's all I
Mhm.
can really say. And yeah, it just
I asked the question because I want the listeners to really kind of like understand the full picture, right? And not like, a lot of blood doesn't equal hemorrhage. A lot of blood doesn't equal you're gonna die. A lot of blood doesn't equal, I'm gonna faint. And so I wanted to know, like, how are you feeling physically? Because I think that is the biggest way to gauge if there's a problem. Like, your body's not just gonna bleed out without showing other signs, you know? Our bodies are so intelligent. It We're created to have these like physical signals, you know, to our brain, like, oh hey, there's something to be concerned about here.
Mhm.
And you know, I know that the hemorrhage story, it's such a thing in the birth world. I mean, you know, quote unquote hemorrhaged with my daughter's birth, but so many things like led up to that, and I wouldn't even call it a hemorrhage. I would call it like my body's trauma response to the things that were happening to me in that birth, you know, like there was so many other layers, like infection and, you know, interventions that were unnecessary and a bunch of other things. So, you know, I think it's important to like really break down that whole narrative of like hemorrhage is this big thing that women have been dying from since the beginning of time, and we need saviors, you know, so that we don't just bleed out.
Yes. No, I love everything that you just said because it is so true. When you were like, even someone's fear of hemorrhage is going to you can create a hemorrhage that's outside of you. You know what I mean? Especially if you
Yeah.
have a midwife, which I feel like in the first case with my first birth, I think there was a fear around it. That's why she kept saying, "There's a lot of blood. There's a lot of blood," and I'm like, luckily, I came in with the mindset of like, I literally don't care if anything. Like, I know my body's gonna know what to do without question.
Yeah.
And what's interesting too is actually in both of my births, looking back, I bled a lot, up until the placenta came out. Like, my body was just like that was intuitively its way of it was time to get it out. So,
Yeah.
someone else's eyes basing on, like, 2 cups or whatever their, I can't remember how many cc's is considered hemorrhage, but it's just, like, that's so arbitrary when it comes to, like, n recognizing that our body just birthed this baby. Like, what makes us think that it doesn't know how to, like, birth
Yeah.
the placenta and finish everything else?
Yeah, and I also feel like it allows us, like, our bodies will allow us to lose the blood that we don't need. Like, you we're not accounting for the fact that as pregnant women, we're literally like holding more blood than your average not pregnant woman would be. So it's like so many the conversation is so nuanced. Yeah, like it's there's so much more to it.
Yes.
But to get back to your story, so you had a lotus birth, and that sounds so beautiful, and I absolutely like. By the way, Veda makes these beautiful lotus, like placenta holders. What do you call them? I don't want to butcher like what it
Oh, like a
is.
lotus bag or placenta bags. Yeah.
Yeah, and they're beautiful, like gorgeous. Um, and but I do want to take a little bit of time to just address what you did post birth that was so unique, and really is how I ultimately met you through this, you know, sovereign living. um so if you can kind of just like run through what you did with your second child that you did differently from your first.
Yes. Yes. So, really quick, I'd love to mention, just like you mentioned, it's interesting that I feel like there's a lot of people in the free birth community that really like love physiological birth. They recognize, interventions and how they actually cause more harm. Um, Cutting of the cord is one intervention that I feel like most free birth moms, or even burning of the cord, that they don't recognize or think about as an intervention. So the second thing that people don't think about is that we just had a birth outside of the system. And then when we get a birth certificate, we're actually putting our baby right into the system that we tried and fought so hard to stay out of. So really recognizing for me that yeah, I knew that I was never going to get my child a birth certificate just because I really learned that everything's a contract. everything a contract. So signing a birth certificate is literally a contract that you're handing over the title of your child to the government. And you're saying, hey, you be in charge of my child, I'll be the guardian. And that's actually why they call us parents, because we are a pair that rents. We don't recognize how many words, legal words, that they've termed that we don't recognize. So when we're handing our child over, and I knew that I could not do this, and knowing what I knew, I couldn't get my child a birth certificate. So I searched high and low on what do you do instead, because there was nothing more important to me than setting my child up for success, right? I love my child more than anything in the whole world, which is why I chose to have a free birth. And a lot of people outside can think like that free birthers are unresponsible or radical. It might sound that same way, choosing not to get a birth certificate, but it deeply feels right to me. And so I found a way to replace the birth certificate without handing over ownership to the government. And the way you do that is you look back on history. Like, what did people do before we had birth certificates that were mandatory? People kept their own records. And that's how our records were passed down. If you look through genealogy, people are keeping records in their family Bibles and doing all of these things, and they actually still stand today. And
Amazing.
what really dupes people is this like 10-day thing, right? You look online, and first of all, it tells you that it's illegal not to get a birth certificate. It's illegal not to get a birth certificate if you're a licensed OB and you're a licensed midwife, because you are contracted to the state. So legally, this whole arbitrary 10 days, people think that they have to do this within, which honestly makes people rush a decision. It's all intentional. Um, that 10 days is on the licensure. It's not actually on the person. So when you're thinking you have to make this decision, do I get my baby birth certificate? Do I not? That 10 days is on the midwife or the OB. They have to register the child within 10 days to keep their license. So they put that on the mother. So I just want people to recognize that too. If you ever at a point decide you want to put your child back into the fold and get a birth certificate, you can. But there is a life completely, I'm recognizing sorry, my brain goes a lot of different places, but we've been taught one way to function in society, and that is with the birth certificate, with the social security number. And a lot of people are recognizing that our schooling system, the things we've been taught, the censorship, it's all purposeful, and it's all to all lead us down the path that they want us to, right? Even with birth information, you have to go find that yourself. It's not just the first Google search that comes up is going to be fear mongering around home birth, you know?
Yeah.
Same thing with the Google search. What if I don't get my baby a birth certificate?
Exactly.
It's going to fear mongering, all these things, right? And people just don't know what to do otherwise. But that's exactly why I help parents replace the birth certificate. And it's going to allow your child to do everything that a birth certificate would do, but it keeps the authority in your hands. That child chose you to be the parent. They didn't choose the state to be the parent.
Yeah.
Or, I mean, you are the actual human that's going to care for this child. So essentially all these legal documentation will replace the birth certificate. So first of all, that's what I help parents do, so they can set their children up for success in life. But the second thing that is like super, super important if you're choosing this path is getting your child a passport. So getting that passport is what allows them to have ID that is going to open up opportunities and throughout their lives. So you want to allow for your child to make free will decisions, right? So it's like as they grow, if they want to get a driver's license and you've said, sorry, I chose not to get you this, like you can't make those decisions. That's not the case. What you're doing is you're setting your child up for success. So first thing I would do is replace the birth certificate with documentation and then get them a passport. And what's beautiful about a passport is that even an expired passport can be used as documentation later in life. So you're setting your child up groundwork for success. I personally recommend that you continue to renew that passport and keep it active throughout their life, but just knowing that you've done what you can to set them up for success, to allow them to later get a bank account or to do any of those things at their free will. There are so many things that people think that they need a birth certificate or social for because that's all we've been taught, but there is always a way to do everything without those two things. And that's exactly what I help parents do.
Yes, I love that so much. And in the workshop that I took with you that you hosted, you totally debunked like a bunch of things that, obviously we're told lies essentially to not do these things. I mean, that's what keeps us in line is like the fear mongering. But yeah, I always thought like it's impossible to get a passport and like how am I going to leave the country if I ever want to do that? But yeah, you totally don't need a birth certificate for that. So I'm going to put links in the show notes if you want to like check out Veda's offerings. Like she has these lovely packages that, she put together to just help parents navigate through all of this because it definitely gets complicated. There's you know, lots of hurdles that they create to make it difficult, but Veda, did all of the research and she like has this all, laid out pretty seamlessly. Um, so I will definitely link that in the show notes. So have you so you I know you had said that you got your first child a birth certificate. So have you like undone that or whatever that however you call that
Really great question. There is a whole like reclaiming process. And so what's funny is that, well, for one, I will say that a lot of parents think that they have to like have done that process for themselves before they have a free baby. That's not the case. For me, my baby was the one that led me first. So it was like, okay, first he needs to be the one that I handle because his
yeah.
immediate, right? I want to make sure he's protected with his whole stuff. Um, and then me. So I'm actually in there is a whole process and I'm doing that for me, my husband, and my first child. And so I do intend on sharing all of that information once I've like fully done
Awesome.
that for myself. But yeah, there is a complete reclaiming process on taking back
That's
control of
awesome.
what was handed over. So stay tuned for all those things.
Yeah, I asked only because I'm sure a lot of my, listeners have birth certificates or, their children do already, and I just don't want them to think that they're doomed
No one
because
is doomed. It's yes, I love that you mentioned that because honestly, like once really what happened with the birth certificate is they've created like a legal entity out of you. They've created a business out of you. So if you have a birth certificate, you can actually use that to your advantage in a lot of different ways. And you can learn basically what it does is it puts you in the public sector and you can choose how you step in and out of the public sector. So it's not necessarily a bad thing if you have a birth certificate, but learning how to reclaim that birth certificate and use it to your benefit really is important. So, but for me
yeah,
personally, like with my baby, knowing that I knew enough to keep him completely in the private and how he can operate in the private and how actually through setting up different entities like a trust that he can still step into the public when he chooses to do business. So there's always going to be a way and not have any fear. Because think about it, like honestly, for me, there's never been a decision I feel like that has served me when I made it out of fear.
absolutely.
So when you're making these decisions out of love, it's going to be completely different when you can think clearly. Like I said, I could think so clearly on the path. And I mean, I'm not going to lie, there were a lot of tears along the path of trying to figure out how to make him sovereign because every time I connected with him and he was like, I need to be born free in all of the ways. Because a birth certificate, I mean, it is an energetic contract. So when you are reclaiming the birth certificate, you're energetically reclaiming that too. But for him, it was like, I need to start from the beginning that way. So just knowing that we have power to do anything, but first of all, it's bringing it to consciousness. The the universal law is that everything requires consent. And so that's why they trick us into consenting to our children to essentially be owned by the state and sign an oath to pay back the national debt. But once you are aware of that, you can actually decide, I don't consent to that, and you can change the narrative. So don't be afraid. I don't want any fear to be infused in any of this if you do have a birth certificate, because we have the power to change and reclaim. So
I love that. Thank you for saying that. Yes, because when things are done at from a place of fear, it's totally different. And I would say that even goes for choosing sovereign birth, free birth, like undisturbed birth, whatever you want to call it. Like, you know, I think it's so important to really ask yourself, where is this coming from? Like, what are your intentions with it, you know? Because I think that that's going to ultimately lead to the outcome, right? Like, if you're doing everything from a place of fear and that's the focus, then unfortunately, there's a bigger chance of the outcome being based off of that fear, which is literally the opposite of what you want.
yes,
Um, so
yes,
yeah, that's so important.
yes. And I love what you just said, because it's like beautiful having like a wild pregnancy, having a free birth is really setting the stage for raising a child sovereign, right? And I'm not going to sugarcoat it and make it sound like this is an easy path, because it's not. Just like doing a wild pregnancy and a free birth isn't the easy path. You've learned to advocate for yourself, and you've learned, despite what all the people around you have to say, with their fear mongering and intentions, that you're standing true into what you truly believe is best for your family. Um, just as it took you to learn and advocate for yourself, raising a child outside of the system is the exact same way. But you've now created this incredible foundation to be able to advocate for yourself and your child in that system.
Yeah,
Because I mean, I will say, even just getting the passport, I help so many families get their babies a passport without a birth certificate, but in most cases there is resistance in some way, shape, or form, that they have to advocate for themselves and their baby and know enough. So just
yeah,
like if you were to go to a hospital or whatever, and basically just having to advocate for yourself, because there's going to be someone
yeah,
else that has limited knowledge. If you're going to the passport agency, they only know how to do things one way. So they're expecting you to hand them the birth certificate. So you're going to
yeah,
have to go in knowing your stuff. But it's so
exactly,
beautiful to have that foundation, that you are setting the stage for your life to be able to stand on that ground and fully trust yourself, because no one cares more about you than your baby or your child as
exactly.
they grow. So there's no better way to set the stage for your child.
I agree. I love this so much. Thank you so much, Veda. This was an
Yeah.
incredible conversation and so valuable, and I'm sure it's going to blow some minds and inspire people. So thank you so much. Is there anything that you would like to share with the listeners? Um, Anything that you're offering currently that you want the listeners to know about?
Yeah. So really, I've created my own free birth guide that's just so simple, something that I created myself when I was preparing for my own free birth. That's just simple things on things to expect, things to prevent emergencies. I'm saying that in quotations too, on just like not fearing things, and how to fully lean into trust, with setting intention, things like that. So it's just a simple, like, read, document, one of the things that I've created. I'm in the currently creating a whole, like, a reclaiming of your birth. Like I said, I do sessions with parents, but I'm creating something that's more vast for people, that allows them to really deep dive their own birth story, heal their own imprints, and create a new imprint, so that their babies can come to this earth doing exactly what they need to do. So really, really preparing parents. So this is ideally for parents that want to consciously conceive, undoing all this ideally before conception. But if you're already pregnant, it's perfect too for you to like undo a lot of these things that you don't recognize, that these imprints are the reason the fears are coming up. that you maybe not a lot of us can even put our finger on, like, why is this a fear coming up? When you start connecting, it connects so many dots, I guess is what I'm saying. When I can walk parents through their own experience, create their own imprints. That's one thing. The Lotus Birth kits that I create, I have a whole ebook on people that want to learn about Lotus Birth. There's a million questions people have on, like, okay, how do you carry a placenta for 3 days, or why would you, like, there's a whole spiritual aspect on it too. So the ebook that I have offered, it really deep dives the what, the why, the how to, everything Lotus Birth. And then also, like you mentioned, I offer a kit with herbs and salts and a bag and really everything you'd need to have a successful Lotus birth. Um, I have templates where parents replace the birth certificate, and also an entire course that walks you from start to finish on how to get the passport without the birth certificate, how to renew the passport, all the things, and then exciting things to come on other ways to set your baby up for success outside of the system. For example, like, if you're keeping your baby in the private sector, how do you allow them to do business? How do you how do you allow them to get, basically be their own bank so that they can take credit out of their own bank rather than a public bank, really like living in the private sector. So those are a few things to come soon that also set your baby up for success that I'll be sharing. So yeah.
So exciting. I love your offerings so much. Um, and on Instagram, your Instagram handle is
Yeah, so it's Veda with a V, Veda dot revival on Instagram. So yeah. And if anyone
awesome.
wants to connect with me, that's a really great place to connect with me. Or you can send me a direct email, info@vedarevival.com. So
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much, Veda. This was amazing. And I hope you have a lovely rest of your day.
thank you for having me.
Of course, anytime. Bye.